September 24, 1958. The Taiwan Strait. A formation of Taiwanese F-86 Sabres is patrolling the airspace, hopelessly outnumbered. Above them, a massive swarm of over 100 Chinese MiG-17s is looking for a fight. For the Sabre pilots, this was a nightmare scenario. The Soviet-built MiGs were faster, they could climb higher, and they were better armed. The MiGs sat comfortably at 40,000 feet, an altitude the Sabres struggled to even reach. In a gunfight, altitude is life. The Chinese pilots knew they were untouchable. All they had to do was dive, attack, and climb back up to safety where the Sabres couldn't touch them. But on this day, the Taiwanese pilots didn't try to climb. They didn't panic, they simply pointed their noses up and waited for a tone. Suddenly, trails of white smoke erupted from the Sabres, but these weren't unguided rockets. These projectiles turned. They curved through the sky, chasing the heat of the MiG engines with impossible precision. In minutes, the untouchable MiGs were falling from the sky. The Chinese pilots were baffled. They saw no muzzle flashes, no tracers, just their wingmen exploding. On that single day, the age of the dogfight ended. The age of the missile had begun. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a dusty garage in the Mojave Desert in the early 1950s. At the time, the U.S. Navy was obsessed with radar. They wanted massive, complex missiles that could shoot down nuclear bombers from miles away. They poured millions into these projects. But a physicist named Dr. William McLean had a different idea. He didn't want complex. He wanted simple. He realized that a jet engine is essentially a giant torch in the sky. You didn't need radar to find it. You just needed an eye that could see heat. The Navy hated the idea. They literally told him to stop working on it. So McLean and his team went underground. They built the missile in their spare time, on weekends, and using funding siphoned from other projects. They called their lab McLean's Hobby Shop. The genius was in the simplicity. Inside the glass nose, a mirror spun at 4,000 RPM. It acted like a gyroscope to keep the missile stable, and it scanned the sky for infrared energy. It had only 24 moving parts. It was basically a radio tube and a rocket motor taped together. It cost a fraction of the Navy's radar missiles. And when they finally tested it, it didn't just work, it crawled right up the tailpipe of a target drone. They named it the Sidewinder, after the desert snake that detects prey by body heat and moves in a winding, C-shaped motion. Fast forward back to 1958, the crisis in the Taiwan Strait is boiling over. The U.S. couldn't intervene directly without starting World War III, but they could send help. In a secret operation codenamed Black Magic, the U.S. Marines shipped 40 Sidewinders to Taiwan. They modified the F-86 Sabres in secret, wiring the missile launch audio directly into the pilots' headsets. The Chinese and their Soviet advisors had no idea this technology existed. They thought heat-seeking missiles were science fiction. When the ambush happened, the Sidewinder achieved a kill ratio that stunned the world. The balance of power had shifted overnight. But the story has a twist that would haunt the U.S. for decades. During the battle, one Sidewinder hit a Chinese MiG-17, but it didn't explode. It lodged itself deep into the airframe, a perfect, intact dud. The Chinese pilot managed to land with the missile sticking out of his fuselage like a spear. The ground crews looked at the missile and realized they had captured the crown jewel of American technology. They crated it up and shipped it straight to Moscow. Soviet engineers took it apart and were shocked. One engineer famously called it a university in missile design. It was so simple, so elegant, they couldn't believe the Americans had built it. They reverse-engineered it down to the screw. The Soviet K-13 missile was such an exact copy that you could practically swap parts with the American version. For the next 30 years, American pilots in Vietnam and the Cold War would be shot at by their own invention. Today, the Sidewinder is still in service. It has evolved from that garage-built rocket into the high-tech AIM-9X, But it all started with a physicist who ignored his bosses and built a heat-seeking robot in his garage. The Sidewinder didn't just change the weapon, it changed the pilot. It turned air combat from a game of eyes and bullets into a game of sensors and tone.